From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. Like oceans, tropical forests are critical to Earth's ecosystem. Every year, tropical deforestation causes more CO2 emissions than the entire European Union. Forest destruction weakens the carbon sink benefits of the biosphere and thus accelerates climate change. Conserving forests also slows the loss of biodiversity and safeguards indigenous groups who depend on forests. Despite the efforts of governments and corporations and public-private coalitions around the world that are committed to reversing deforestation, high rates of forest loss persist. Our speaker today will discuss recent public and private initiatives to control tropical deforestation. For his work, our speaker has been awarded the 2009 Francqui Prize, the 2014 Volvo Environment Prize, and the 2019 Blue Planet Prize. PhD and professor of Earth System Sciences at Stanford University. Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Hello, everyone. So I will discuss, how can we reverse tropical deforestation? And just as a background, it's still a major issue today. About 12 million hectares of tree cover is being lost every year in the tropics, most of it being humid tropical primary forests. So the ones that's very rich in carbon, therefore leading to massive CO2 emissions. Also the types of forests that's very rich in biodiversity and plays a major role in regulating the water cycle and to protect soils. These forests also host a number of indigenous communities, therefore, that feel threatened by deforestation. As you will see as I speak, a key fact is to understand that about a third of all tropical deforestation is associated with the production of a few commodities that are exported to emerging and rich economies. Palm oil, soy, beef, timber, cacao, coffee being the main ones. There's been quite a lot of work on what kind of policies could reverse or halt deforestation. And they fall into two categories. One are the government-led interventions, such as protected areas or investment in sustainable agriculture. And the other family are the voluntary standards of sustainable production for agriculture or forestry in these forest environments. Now, the intensity of the international commitment to reduce deforestation dates back to 2006, where there's been a major moratorium on all production of soybean in the Brazilian Amazon. The latest one being the 2021, the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest. And you see that the total trend is still a massive increase in tropical forest. Yet there are some success stories. There's some hope. If we look here at Costa Rica, which we all associate now as a very green economy, a paradise of ecotourism, well, actually, if we look here, from 1930 all the way to today, at the area or the fraction of the country that was under forest cover. When I was a student, Costa Rica was always known as one of the worst cases of deforestation. But then something quite extraordinary happened. Around the mid-80s, there's been a complete reversal from net deforestation to net reforestation. We find similar forest transitions, as we call them, in a handful of other tropical countries, such as Vietnam. We see the same. Here we go back to 1900, all the way to 2005. So you see massive deforestation here. And then again, this very abrupt reversal leading to net reforestation.
How many hours might be represented by any one of these studies that are plotted on your chart?
In total, each of these graphs is associated with either one PhD that's over 3 or 4 years, by a top student with a lot of help from more technical persons and advisors. Okay, so let's now review some of the main policies that are currently implemented to control deforestation. The most obvious one is what we call land use zoning or protected areas. national parks and forest reserves, concession reserves, all forms of restriction on land use to protect forest. That's for Cameroon, for instance, here in Central Africa, and all what you see in color, in dark green, in light green, in this kind of mauve color, are all different types of land use zoning. That's very efficient, of course, to prevent any human activity within the border of these zones. And by locating these protected areas there, these countries can meet some international agreed target on land use protection with a minimum social and economic cost. So therefore, even though the forest is protected within these areas, the additional impact on reducing deforestation might be quite low. Another policy that's very widely applied to control land use and deforestation is what is known as eco-certification. These are these labels that you recognize on your coffee or cacao or tea that signal that that production has been made based on sustainability standards. So these standards are purely voluntary. So that means that the producers can decide to comply or not. If they do comply, they are audited. And then their coffee or cacao or tea is being sold on the market with this label at a premium price. The farmers who will decide to get their production certified tend to be, on the first place, the best farmers, the most sustainable ones. And very quickly, I learned that if I was getting to a farm like this, I knew that this farmer would be eco-certified. But then if I would go to his neighbor and his houses would be like that, I knew that it would be very unlikely that this other farmer would be certified. In other words, we certify the farmers who, on the first place, already have the best practices. In that study in Colombia, we used this very detailed satellite data, which you see here, where in dark green, you have the forest, and in this lighter green, you have all the fields. And every dot that you see here, this little dot that I'm showing now, is the location of one farm. What we did, we sampled hundreds of farms, and we always select one farm that was eco-certified and another one, which was a neighbor and that was not certified, but which had very similar attributes: same farm size, same level of education, same market accessibility. But we produced these results. Let's just focus on this one here. Tree forest gain, the increase in tree cover for the certified farms in green and for the non-certified farm in blue. The only problem is only a small fraction of all producers, in the cacao, coffee, etc. sector are actually certified on the order of 5 to maximum 20%.
So what we see is that in your study, the difference between tree cover loss among certified and uncertified farms was small, but the difference in tree cover gain was significant. Sum the loss and the gain together, you get the net tree cover gain, and you see that it's considerably more favorable for certified farms.
In order to understand that, we can think about the world being organized like this glass of champagne, which I'm sure will make many people quite happy. With the top of the glass being all the consumers. We have 7.8 billion consumers of commodities that have an impact on forest. The bottom of the glass are all the producers, that are producing these forest risk commodities: the palm oil, the soybean, the meat, the coffee, the cacao, 250 million more or less. The traders or the retailers, the large transnational companies that are shipping all these goods from production all to the consumers, that's no more than something like 300 very large actors controlling maybe 80% of that trade.
What you're pointing out is that with the 250 million producers of forest risk commodities, all their products have to filter through just 300 companies to get to the roughly 8 billion consumers of the world. And if you can influence these 300 companies, you can basically have an effect on the forest risk commodities that are getting to the rest of the world.
This is the evolution from 2012 to 2018. This is the number of commitments. Of course, one company can make multiple commitments for different commodities, palm oil, soy, cattle, etc. So you see, it's quite significant now. A very large fraction of the traders in these forest commodities have in place commitments to remove deforestation. However, of course, this is mostly effective for export of these commodities from tropical producing countries to rich economies where the consumers, of course, put a very high priority on the sustainability of their consumption. So for this to be effective, mostly the trade from tropical countries to rich countries would have an impact. These graphs here represent the global trade in the four main forestry commodities: beef, soybean, cacao, and palm oil. And here we have the origin, the production of these commodities, where it's being produced, from Brazil, for instance, and here the market, where it's being sold to. We see, for instance, here that a very large fraction of the meat produced in Brazil is actually destined to the domestic market. In that sense, the supply chain commitments by these big traders do not have a great impact, because, of course, it's mostly the international trade that will be impacted. For cacao, the situation is very different. The domestic market is very small, and most of the trade from Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana is going to the European Union and North America. So for these traders, the pressure from these rich countries, from the consumers and the retailers on the traders, has a major impact on production, because they do represent very large market shares. Palm oil also quite small market share, and soy also pretty small market shares. A very large and increasing share of forestry commodities is sold on domestic markets, and therefore they escape the pressure of these supply chain initiatives. A small share of these commodities that are exported are actually exported to Europe and North America, only 9% on average. And a growing share of these exports go to emerging markets, China, India, other emerging economies that at this stage of their development put a priority on cheap imports. So a number of policies have been created to actually pay in cash forest owners who decide not to clear their forest. Does it work? Well, we did conduct a very large-scale experiment in Uganda a few years ago. For control villages, all the ones in red here, we said, okay, we go to the village, we talk to all farmers, and we tell them, well, we offer you a contract. If you sign and you commit not to cut trees on your land, we'll pay you $25 per year and per hectare. If you sign the contract and you cut trees, you won't get the money, but you are not getting any sanction either, so you don't take any risk. For the control villages, we did nothing. We just observed how they were dealing with their forest with no intervention. And then we could compare after a couple of years, was there a difference? Was the payment to this forest owner making a difference in the rate of deforestation? And it did in a massive way. We reduced deforestation by more than half through that simple, very low payment, only $25 per hectare and per year. You could ask yourself, how did we know about this deforestation? Well, today we have this really high resolution satellite data where you can see any tree. So in red, you have all the trees. In blue, you have the farms. You can count any tree before the payment, after the payment, for every village, for every property. So we can get these data with a very high level of precision.
How many years between that base and the deforestation we see on the right side?
3 years.
From the baseline to the end line, we see in this particular region that you're showing us that the deforestation has been quite severe. It looks like about 40%. Now, this is not typical of the world, but you're pointing out in this one particular region that you have ways to measure the deforestation in different parts of the world.
So now I've just shown you 4 types of policies: protected areas, deforestation like in Costa Rica or Brazil in the 80s, 90s, or Colombia at some stage, not anymore, they really use a very large number of simultaneous policies to control deforestation. So for each of these countries, we counted all and characterized all the policies related to deforestation. Now, in green, what you see are all the domestic public policies, the government-led policies. And there's a very clear sequence here. Now, it always starts with kind of command and control, protected areas, ban on deforestation with sanctions. This is the dark green. Then they bring some incentives to increase compliance with this. This is the kind of payment for ecosystem services I've just described in the light green here. Then they create a number of enabling measures to facilitate adoption and implementation of these policies. Better property right regimes, better statistics on forest cover, better education. Then you see some funding arriving. This is a very large international program that stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. It's a UN-led program that's funding countries to adopt zero deforestation policies. So you see they arrive quite late into the sequence. And then finally, you have the supply chain initiatives that I've described also, where the private sector intervenes in the countries where there's already a very solid policy ecosystems to control deforestation. And these are the countries where they decide to do some sustainable sourcing of their commodities. As we were studying these countries, in addition to identifying what were the effective policies that led to that reversal in deforestation, as I was explaining before, we also found something else that was very disturbing. Let's go to Vietnam. That's the first country where we've shown that, about 15 years ago. As Vietnam was protecting its forest, there was a complete ban on logging in these countries. I noted one day that it was still exporting some wood furniture, in tropical wood from Vietnam to China or other countries or Europe or the US. Wow, where is this wood coming from? Because there's a complete logging ban. That's when we realized that at the same time as Vietnam was protecting its forest, it was importing massive amount of timber from its neighbor, Laos and Cambodia, two countries which at the time had a very poor governance system. A lot of this logging and import of timber was completely illegal, not reported in statistics. We had to use ingenious methods to quantify that. So basically what Vietnam was doing, it was simply offshoring its deforestation. I protect my forest and I go and clear the forest of my neighbors. First, there are a number of policies to reduce deforestation, and they are somewhat effective. None of them is the perfectly effective, but they all have a positive impact. Now, really the challenge is to upscale all these interventions. They work, we implemented them locally, but not at a scale that's sufficient to really have an impact. But most importantly, as I've shown to the end, we have to develop the synergies, the complementarities between these public policies, private initiatives, voluntary standards, because together they can really transform the system. And finally, this focus on national policies is not sufficient because then you create the risk of leakage and spillovers to other countries. So it's really important to adopt an international approach to that issue. Thank you for your attention.
Where did you grow up and when did you first become interested in the environment and helping us to help the environment?
Well, I grew up in Belgium in the countryside. We're living next to a big forest. So I was spending all my weekends and evenings hiking in that forest. Wanted to study something related to nature conservation, but also I was always very keen to travel. So I studied geography. It's a discipline where you do discover the world. You try to understand how things are going on elsewhere. And throughout my studies and still now, I kept traveling to very remote places in Africa, Asia, South America, initially just to discover these places and then increasingly to conduct studies on on the way they interact with the natural environment. I did study at the University of Louvain in Belgium, one of the oldest universities in the world, created in 1425.
And you got a PhD there.
PhD in geography, yes.
Uh-huh. And then when did you come to Stanford?
So first I was assistant professor at Boston University. Then I went back full-time to Europe. I did most of my career there. And then 15 years ago, Stanford opened a position in my field. They asked me to apply here, which I did. But then my wife didn't want to come to the US, so I negotiated a split appointment. So I'm spending 6 months per year here at Stanford, the winter and spring quarter, and the rest of the year in Europe at University of Louvain, where I'm still teaching there. And also for the last year and a half now, I've been one of the chief scientific advisors to the European Commission, which, as you may know, has a major policy called the Green Deal, where they have adopted a number of really pioneer directives, one of them being on imported deforestation. So now in Europe, starting next year, any import of commodities that have caused deforestation at the place of production will be banned from Europe.
What's a day in the life profession like? What percent of the year are you in the field? And how often are you dealing in the office and how often teaching?
Yeah, so, as a professor, we do some teaching, not a lot, maybe we teach 1 or 2 courses per quarter. So that would be 4 hours in the classroom, plus all the preparation time, because of course, we always update our course, we never teach the same thing. So that's a small fraction of our work. Then we advise, a whole research team. Quite a significant effort is in fundraising to be able to fund that research. So we write proposals, they're reviewed, a tiny fraction of them are actually funded. And then on that base, we can recruit postdocs, PhD students, and we do interact with them on a daily basis. Plus, we do our own research, and that research does involve field work, as you may have guessed from my presentation here. So typically, I would visit 3 field sites per year, spending now no more than 3 weeks, 1 month in a site at a time, because I have more responsibilities at the university. But as a more junior professor, I was able to spend 2, 3 months, 4 months per year in the field, talking to farmers, making some field measurements. And then the other aspect of the life of a professor is all the outreach to the public, as I'm doing right now with you, but also to policymakers. And that's why, my role as a science advisor is very important, because that's why we translate our scientific findings to decision makers in the public sphere, public government, but also in the private companies, as you have seen in my field, talking to these traders, to these retailers that are in the field of food is very important, because that's one of the major drivers of deforestation.
And so what countries are guilty of the most egregious deforestation, and what ones are doing the best job of reducing deforestation? Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? I need to get some names.
So heroes, clearly, I've shown the graph. Costa Rica has been very remarkable, massive protection of the forest, and they really make it worth in economic terms, because they've developed this whole green ecotourism that is becoming a major part of the economy now. So it's a very clever way to do it, because you protect the forest, but you derive value from your natural capital. So that's really one of the best examples. One of the worst examples these days might happen, in some weak states in Central Africa. But then you have all these countries that in their recent history may have had very high rates of deforestation, like Indonesia and Malaysia, that really managed to put that deforestation under control over the last couple of years. Now, if you look at the curve for Indonesia, it was really peaking until recently. But the last 5 years have been quite remarkable also in decreasing forest destruction.
When people hear the term deforestation, immediately they think about Brazil. And there's just recently been an amazing political change in Brazil. So Bolsonaro's out and Lula is in. What does that mean in practical terms to you as a scientist studying deforestation in one of the most sensitive areas in the world, the Brazilian Amazon rainforest.
Yes, during his first term, President Lula managed to really bring the problem of deforestation under control with his very famous Minister of the Environment, Marina Silva. And that was becoming a big success story. That they really managed to work with the industrial sector, the soybean sector and the meat industry to achieve that. And of course, when Bolsonaro was elected, it kind of undermined completely all the successes of Lula, and then we went back to a rapid increase in deforestation. So now, the priority of Lula is to bring things back under control, which is very hard because, of course, Bolsonaro had unleashed all these forest colonizers that were invading, the Amazon for farming, logging, gold mining, and a lot of these damage is irreversible. It takes really decades to reconstruct the biodiversity and the primary forest. So that's really disturbing that you may have these phases of great success under right political leadership, but it becomes very fragile, very vulnerable to the type of political leader. It can be reversed much faster than you built that whole policy infrastructure to reduce deforestation.
But what if America created a policy of planting trees in the Rockies, where we have this huge uninhabited space of nature, and we actually tried to add tree, aspens and other kinds of trees in massive scale, billions of trees. Could we begin to improve how would that affect the environment in America and globally?
Of course, it would have a great impact, provided that the forest planners can ensure that these forests will stay there for a long time, that you are not just creating fuel for the next big fire, for instance, that you're not creating a situation where there will be a massive invasion of pests that will create tree mortality and therefore, again, create a big fuel for fire. So, yeah, it's a complex field. It's not just about planting the tree. It's really to preserving, the long-term sustainability of these forests with a landscape mosaic that keeps all the fire risk away from these forests, and create a spatial pattern in such that if there's a big fire coming in one plot, it doesn't spread across the landscape. So having these openings between large forests is a way also to contain the spread of some fires.
So Stanford professor Eric Lambin, recipient of the Francqui, the Volvo, and the Blue Planet Prize. Everybody who listens to our show benefits from these kinds of sessions. So you're like a wealth of information on a very valuable subject. Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you very much for having me, yes.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.